At 7:56 on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft swooped down over Hawaii. Their target? The US Pacific Fleet at anchor in its base at Pearl Harbor. Five US ships were hit immediately. A few minutes later, more Japanese aircraft joined in. By 8:35, 2 US battleships were sinking, 2 had capsized, and 2 were badly damaged. A 7th battleship, the Nevada, slipped her moorings and was heading out to sea when she too was caught and forced to beach. Simultaneously, Japanese Zero fighters strafed US aircraft lined up on the island's airstrips. They also shot up nearby army barracks. By the end of the attack, dozens of US warships had been sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were also destroyed. The next day, US President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The stage was set. Could Japan knock out the United States with a swift blow before the huge might of America ground it down? It would become one of the great conflicts of World War II. Japan's first steps towards war had come in August 1940. Capitalizing on France's defeat in Europe, it seized control of air bases in the north of the French colony of Indochina. It was looking for a quick and easy expansion of its empire. A year later, it issued an ultimatum demanding the use of all French air bases throughout Indochina. When the French hesitated, the Japanese invaded and seized control of the entire colony. Japan felt the consequences almost immediately. The United States froze its overseas financial assets, effectively robbing the country of its ability to buy oil. Japan faced a choice: climb down and lose face, or seize more territory and up the stakes. For a new Japanese government, under the aggressive General Hideki Tojo, there was no question about which course to take. Japanese army and navy commanders were told to prepare for a swift war to occupy all the far eastern territories controlled by Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States. The country was expecting a swift victory. Japan saw the Americans, in particular, as a nation of pleasure lovers with no stomach for a lengthy war and heavy casualties. The Japanese military calculated that if they could destroy the US Pacific Fleet, the US would quickly sue for peace. It was now that they decided to attack Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, was put in charge. He had 10 battleships, 10 aircraft carriers, and the world's most advanced naval aircraft. Against him, the US Pacific Fleet had 8 World War I vintage battleships and 2 carriers. Yamamoto planned the attack with great care. He would hit the US fleet in Pearl Harbor on a Sunday, since, according to intelligence reports, it usually spent the weekends in port. In total radio silence, the Japanese strike force gathered in Tankan Bay in the northerly Kuril Islands. The fleet set sail on November the 26th, 1941. Meanwhile, as a decoy, Japanese negotiators arrived in Washington to discuss a possible Japanese withdrawal from China. The Japanese fleet refueled after several days at sea. 3 days later, it was off Hawaii. The Americans were still blissfully unaware that anything was wrong. At 6 a.m. on December the 7th, after a final briefing, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off. As the Japanese aircraft dived into the attack, US personnel was still just stirring on a fine Sunday morning. It was all over in less than 2¼ hours. Yamamoto's plan had worked like a dream. Or had it? There was only one problem. The US fleet's 2 aircraft carriers had not been in Pearl Harbor at the time and had escaped the attack. Yamamoto's main aim of crippling the US Pacific Fleet had only partially succeeded. US naval air power in the region was still intact. But in the United States, there was shock and disbelief. It quickly turned into a mood of fury and determination. Angry mobs attacked the Japanese embassy. Japan had disturbed the sleeping giant. The US Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, spoke for many.
The Japs started this war. We are going to finish it.
Yet before the US could mobilize its full strength, the Japanese were to inflict more humiliating defeats on the Western Allies. In December 1941, as America was licking its wounds after Pearl Harbor, Japan launched a series of attacks on Western colonies in Southeast Asia. It thought it had knocked out America. Now it moved against Britain and its colonies. The first to be hit was Malaya, where a Japanese force came ashore in the northeast of the country. The plan was that it should make its way south down the east coast. The invasion force was met by a contingent of British Indian troops. But after a day of fighting, they were brushed aside. Meanwhile, further north in Thailand, a second Japanese landing was unopposed. 30,000 Japanese troops were soon making their way down the western coast of Malaya. The target of the two groups, Singapore, the center of British military and political rule in the Far East. Britain had turned the island into what it believed was an impregnable fortress. But all the guns pointed south, out to sea. The Japanese were approaching by land from the north. Yet British military commanders remained remarkably untroubled. They didn't rate the Japanese as fighting men and believed the Malay jungle was, anyway, virtually impassable. But the Japanese had other ideas. To soften up Singapore, they attacked the city from the air. Britain sent the new battleship Prince of Wales and a battlecruiser, Repulse, to attack Japanese troop convoys. They were met by Japanese bombers. Both warships were sunk in less than 2 hours. Almost 1,000 of their crew were lost. It was the greatest British naval disaster of World War II. In an era of aircraft and aircraft carriers, it was now clear the battleship, for years the mainstay of the British Navy, had had its day. Back on land, the Japanese continued to head south towards Singapore. On January the 11th, 1942, Kuala Lumpur was captured. The British forces fell back and withdrew to Singapore. There were now about 100,000 British soldiers to defend it. They faced a force of only 30,000 Japanese. Even without their big guns, the British should have been able to hold out. The Japanese launched an assault in early February. It was supported by more airstrikes. The British defense was soon reduced to chaos. Civilian casualties began to escalate. Four days later, the Japanese had pushed through the last of the British defensive lines. The commander, General Arthur Percival, surrendered with over 90,000 men. Never in the history of the British Army had a commander in charge of such a large force had to surrender, and to an enemy general whose force was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Britain's 200-year-old power and prestige in the Far East had been wiped out in just 10 weeks. But it wasn't the only disaster. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the Japanese forces were equally triumphant. The British garrison in Hong Kong fought for 2 weeks before succumbing to a Japanese invasion. In the Philippines, America fared no better. Here, a preemptive bombing raid caught large numbers of US aircraft neatly lined up at Clark Field. Most were destroyed. Two days later, with US air power virtually non-existent, Japanese troops began to land. The local Philippine troops melted away. The Japanese advanced rapidly. 10 days later, Manila was captured. The US soldiers were forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. Here they hoped to hold out until a relief force could be sent. It never came. On April 3rd, 1942, Japanese troops launched a major assault on US positions. After 4 days heavy fighting, they broke through. The Americans surrendered 2 days later. That left just one British colony in the region, Burma. In early 1942, Japanese forces pushed into the south of the country. The British defenses had been utterly neglected. There were only some 15,000 men defending the country. They were no match for the Japanese. The Allied troops mounted a brief but doomed resistance. Less than 2 months after invading Burma, the Japanese had seized the capital, Rangoon. 8 weeks later, the British had been pushed entirely out of the country. In just under 6 months, the Japanese had seized control of the whole eastern rim of the Pacific. Their Oriental blitzkrieg had been swift and crushing. Yet already, there were warning signs that they were not as powerful as they appeared. On April the 18th, 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America struck back at the Japanese. US bombers flying low over Tokyo dropped bombs on the city close to the Emperor's palace. Others struck Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. The raid, authorized by President Roosevelt himself, was daring in the extreme. The B-25 Mitchell bombers had not been designed to be launched from aircraft carriers. They barely managed to lumber off the deck of the USS Hornet, which had brought them to within 700 miles of the Japanese capital. But that didn't diminish their effectiveness in the air. In Japan, the raids caused profound shock. After their runaway successes of the past 4 months, they had never expected an attack on their homeland. Japan's military planners now decided to extend the country's defenses. If they could seize additional strategic outposts in the Pacific, they could attack and destroy Allied forces before they even came close to the homeland. Japan already controlled much of the Chinese coast, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. They had also seized the Dutch East Indies. Now they decided to strike south and attack Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and east to take the island of Midway in the middle of the Pacific. It would mean the homeland was surrounded by a string of fortified positions. Yet even as Japan was planning its move, its operations were severely compromised, though it only realized this after the war. The United States had broken its military and diplomatic codes. By spring 1942, the US Navy's code-breaking team in Hawaii was reading enough messages to give it a remarkably accurate insight into Japan's intentions. So it was that the US Commander-in-Chief in the region, Admiral Chester Nimitz, learnt the details and timing of Japan's planned invasions of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. If successful, they would cut off Australia from her allies. A Japanese bombing raid on Darwin had already caused widespread fear of an invasion. In early May 1942, the Japanese plan to widen its defensive perimeter was launched. They seized the Solomon Islands. Two days later, the Japanese carrier force entered the Coral Sea in preparation for the main assault on Papua New Guinea. But this time, the Americans had anticipated them. Admiral Nimitz had ordered 2 US aircraft carriers and a number of smaller warships into the area. For 2 days, the rival fleets searched for each other. Then, on May the 7th, US aircraft located and sank the Japanese carrier Shoho. The Battle of the Coral Sea was underway. Early the following day, the Japanese responded, unleashing a hail of torpedoes and bombs. To begin with, the U.S. aircraft carrier Yorktown managed to avoid the Japanese torpedoes. But then she took a bomb which penetrated 4 decks before exploding. 37 men were killed. The larger and less maneuverable carrier Lexington was also hit by several bombs as well as 2 torpedoes. She developed a heavy list to port. The Americans returned fire, attacking the Japanese carrier Shokaku. The first U.S. raid was blunted by Japanese Zero fighters, which forced the U.S. Douglas Devastator bombers to drop their torpedoes too far out. All the torpedoes missed. But a second wave of U.S. dive bombers struck home. The Shokaku's deck was so badly damaged, she could no longer be used by aircraft. After 2 days of fighting, the 2 forces finally disengaged. That evening, the Lexington, still afloat, suddenly erupted in a huge explosion. There had been an undetected leak of aviation fuel that had caught fire. Amazingly, all but 215 of the nearly 3,000 men on board were rescued. Later that evening, an American torpedo scuttled the burning hulk. The Battle of the Coral Sea was, on paper, a draw. Each side had lost 1 carrier and had another severely damaged. Strategically, however, it was a major U.S. success. It had prevented the Japanese from seizing more territory, and it had stopped them from isolating Australia. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked a new era in naval tactics. It was the first major sea battle in which the opposing ships were completely out of visual contact. It was fought, instead, by aircraft flying from carriers. It would soon become clear which side had adapted to the new form of naval conflict more successfully. By the late spring of 1942, Japan and America were deadlocked. Japan needed a quick victory if it was not to be ground down by the huge resources of the United States. In mid-May, it began its next move. US codebreakers reported Japanese plans for a new attack. It would be on Target AF, somewhere in the mid-Pacific. The problem for the Americans was that they had no idea where Target AF was. Could it be a reference to Midway Island near Hawaii? An ideal jumping-off point for another attack on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor? The code-breaking team suggested a way to find out. The US Air Base on Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message reporting problems with the island's water system. Almost immediately, the code breakers intercepted a Japanese signal that Target AF was having water supply problems. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew exactly where the enemy would strike. The Japanese plan was typically complex. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific would draw away part of the US fleet, while Midway was seized by an occupation force. The Americans would be obliged to hurriedly commit their carrier force to retaking the island. There they would be annihilated by a huge Japanese naval presence, including 4 large aircraft carriers. It was the second Japanese attempt to wipe out the US Navy in the Pacific within a year. Forewarned, the American carriers left port and moved to a position where they could ambush the Japanese. On June 3, 1942, Japanese forces launched the expected attack on the Aleutian Islands. Nimitz didn't respond. Then, early the next morning, the main Japanese carrier force launched a first airstrike on Midway Island to soften up its defenses. US warplanes from the island intercepted them. Most were outdated Brewster Buffaloes and were easily shot down by the more agile Japanese Zero fighters. But the Japanese attack had been blunted. Midway's defenses had not been broken. The Japanese commander, Admiral Chuiki Nagumo, faced a difficult decision. He'd kept some of his aircraft in reserve, loaded with munitions designed specifically for attacking ships, just in case the US fleet was spotted. Should he now order this reserve to be stripped of its torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs and reloaded with high-explosive and fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway? It would leave him ill-equipped to take on the US Navy, but he calculated it was a risk worth taking. Then, just as the reloading was underway, he received unwelcome news. A US naval force had been spotted. Was this the US carrier force, or a smaller, less significant fleet of ships? Nagumo was in a dilemma. Should he continue with the second strike on Midway, or should he once again re-equip his bombers to take on the US vessels? Nagumo decided to gamble. He would push ahead with the second strike on Midway. His hope was that when the bombers returned, there would still be time to rearm them to take on the US ships. Even as he weighed the odds, the Japanese carriers were attacked by US bombers. Every available Japanese Zero fighter was scrambled before the US bombers were repelled. Then came another report from reconnaissance planes. The US force did indeed contain aircraft carriers. Nagumo was, once again, on the spot. His aircraft were halfway through reloading, but the US carriers were a much more important target. He took a second gamble. He decided to change their weapons yet again to attack the US force. But while he did so, his ships would be sitting ducks. Almost immediately, they came under attack from low-flying US torpedo bombers. But they were old and slow and attacked without fighter support. As they approached the Japanese fleet, they were rapidly shot down. For a brief period, it looked as though Nagumo's gamble had paid off. Then, just as his bombers had been reloaded and were ready to take on the US carriers, disaster struck. US dive bombers, approaching unseen at high altitude, hurtled down on his ships. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Nagumo had gambled once too often and was now at the mercy of American air power. Within 5 minutes, the US dive bombers had reduced 3 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers to flaming wrecks. All would later sink. The fourth carrier, the Hiryu, had been masked by a rainstorm and that afternoon mounted a desperate counterattack. The US carrier Yorktown was severely damaged. It was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine several days later. But the Japanese fight back was short-lived. Late in the afternoon that day, the Hiryu was also hit and turned into a blazing pyre. In a matter of hours, Japan's mastery of the sea had been destroyed. The attack on Midway Island had achieved nothing. But it had cost Japan its finest carriers and 332 aircraft. Well over 2,000 sailors had also died. America now ruled the waves in the Pacific. Yet Japan was still undefeated on land and a powerful, threatening force in the air. In the coming months, it would try to maximize these advantages. By summer 1942, Japanese plans to build a defensive ring of occupied territories around their homeland had still not been completed. Heavy losses at sea had frustrated their attempts to grab Papua New Guinea and islands in the Central Pacific. Japanese planners now came up with a new plan. If they couldn't do it by sea, they'd do it by land. On July the 21st, a division-sized force of experienced jungle troops landed on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. They immediately struck west to capture Port Moresby, the capital. Progress was swift at first. The small Australian defence force was completely outnumbered. Within weeks, the Japanese had captured the main pass over the Owen Stanley Mountains. They then halted to await reinforcements before the final push on Port Moresby. The Australians also mustered new forces. When the Japanese moved off again, they now met much stiffer resistance. For the first time, Japanese troops were up against men who matched them for training, experience, and morale. The Australians stood their ground, and the Japanese were temporarily brought to a standstill. But conditions in the jungle were appalling. There was constant tropical rain. Malaria was rife. The Australians were eventually, again, forced to retreat. After 2 months of grim fighting, the Japanese were within 30 miles of Port Moresby. Then, finally, US reinforcements arrived. Through September and October, the Japanese were, in their turn, forced back. The Japanese made an heroic but suicidal stand. Many chose to die fighting rather than surrender. It took the Allies another 2 months before the Japanese were finally overwhelmed. It had been a bloodbath. "15,000 Japanese troops had embarked on the operation. Only 3,000 got away. The Japanese were in trouble. They'd lost at sea. They were now rapidly losing the initiative on land. American military might was asserting itself. There was only one alternative left: air power. Through the summer of 1942, Japanese engineers began building a string of airstrips across the Pacific. One was on the island of Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands. It was particularly well situated to threaten US convoys heading for Australia. It would become the focus of an epic battle. In July 1942, an amphibious force of US Marines invaded the island. They landed without resistance. The plan was to capture the half-built airstrip, complete it, and then turn it into a US base. But the Japanese were not ready to give up. That night, they sent in a naval force to land reinforcements and to attack the fleet of US ships supporting the Marines. In a dazzling display of night fighting, the Japanese cruisers sank 4 Allied warships and drove the rest out to sea. The Marines were now marooned, without supplies and without much of their equipment. They dug in around the airstrip. Despite constant bombardment, using construction machinery left behind by the Japanese, they pushed ahead with the completion of the airfield. Two weeks later, a group of US Wildcat fighters and Dauntless dive bombers flew in. They were not a moment too soon. The next day, newly arrived Japanese troops launched a series of suicidal attacks on the airstrip. Over the following months, wave after wave of fanatical troops were thrown into the battle. By the winter of 1942, the two sides had fought themselves to a standstill, both now dug in to defensive positions. Then, in December, the exhausted US Marines were replaced by fresh troops. US soldiers now began a new push on the increasingly isolated pockets of Japanese resistance. By early February 1943, the Americans had finally won control of Guadalcanal. They had now beaten the Japanese at sea and on land. They had even denied them access to the air. The Oriental Blitzkrieg had failed. The Japanese Empire now faced a foe that was still growing in strength at a rate it could never hope to match. It was the beginning of a fundamental shift in the course of the war. As Hitler marched triumphantly across Western Europe in the early summer of 1940, his fellow dictator in Italy, Benito Mussolini, dreamt of a similar campaign further south.
Chiama il sangue principi che sorgono e che nascono e I principi che declinano. La vittoria è per noi, per I primi.
His dream was to build a new Roman Empire that would see Italy expand not only along the northern Mediterranean coast, but south through North Africa. He would turn the Mediterranean into Mare Nostrum, our sea. But it was a dream that would turn into a disaster. It would lead, in due course, to Mussolini's death and fatally overextend his German ally. At the start of the war, Italy already controlled Libya and Abyssinia, Ethiopia today. Mussolini calculated that if he could take British-controlled Egypt and Sudan, he would be able to create a huge swathe of Italian-controlled territory. It looked like an easy campaign. Italy had 10 times more troops in the region than Britain. In September 1940, Mussolini invaded Egypt and captured the small coastal town of Sidi Barrani. There, the Italians stopped and dug in. Britain gathered all available forces for a counterattack. On December the 6th, 1940, they moved in across the desert. Just 4 days later, they overran the Italian defenses. Nearly 40,000 Italians were taken prisoner. It was the first sign that the Italian army was in poor fighting shape. The remainder of the defeated Italians retreated back across the Libyan border. The British followed in hot pursuit. In barely a month, the Western Desert Force, as it was called, had advanced almost 600 miles across Libya. It now paused and dug in at the Libyan coastal town of El Agheila. Almost half of Italy's Libyan empire had been seized and over 100,000 Italian troops taken prisoner. Meanwhile, to the south, British forces invaded Italian-controlled Abyssinia. The fighting lasted for nearly 12 months. The rugged terrain made communications and transport difficult. But in the end, the Italians were forced to surrender. But even as Abyssinia was being secured, Mussolini's empire building was causing problems in another part of the Mediterranean. Nearly 2 years earlier, in April 1939, as part of his plan for a new Roman Empire, Mussolini had occupied Albania. The following year, he demanded Greece become an Italian colony. When the Greeks refused, he invaded. The Greeks were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, but they swiftly turned back the Italian advance. By the beginning of March 1941, the Italians had not only been pushed out of Greece, but out of much of neighboring Albania too. Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, promised help so the Greeks could finish the job. But Britain's forces were already heavily committed elsewhere. So it was that the British units in North Africa were told to abandon their Libyan adventure and ship much of the force across the Mediterranean to Albania. As the Italian troops were now pushed back, Mussolini's Balkan ambitions fell apart. The Italians were in deep trouble. It left Hitler with a problem. Should he divert troops from elsewhere in Europe to support his most important European ally, or should he abandon Mussolini to his fate? He decided to help. In April 1941, over 500,000 German troops swept down into Yugoslavia and Greece. For Germany, it would prove to be the beginning of a fateful entanglement with Mussolini's political dreams. But at first, all went well. The Greeks, despite British help, were unable to hold the Germans back, and in late April, the Axis forces captured the Greek capital of Athens. Some 30,000 men were evacuated to the British-controlled island of Crete. Hitler decided to flush them out. He had at his command some 22,000 parachute and glider-borne troops, backed up by 150 Stuka dive bombers. The landings began at first light on May the 20th. To begin with, they focused on the main airfields. The Allied forces were overstretched. There were incessant German air attacks. The Germans soon captured the airfields and began to fly in reinforcements. The Allies were pushed back across the island. Two weeks later, it was all over. 15,000 Allied troops had to be evacuated. A further 18,000 were taken prisoner. The Axis powers now controlled much of the Mediterranean and the critical supply routes to North Africa. It looked as though Hitler's decision to support Mussolini had paid off. He was poised to drive Britain out of the entire region. In February 1941, a junior German general arrived at the Libyan port of Tripoli. Erwin Rommel was one of the rising stars of the German army and had been chosen by Hitler as the man to rescue his Italian ally and retake North Africa for the Axis powers. The first units of his Africa Corps were soon landing. Some 16,000 men and over 100 tanks had been diverted from the European front. The Axis forces rapidly outnumbered the British troops, depleted by the war in Greece and Crete. Rommel advanced towards the British positions at El Agheila and attacked. As the British fell back, Rommel pursued them. In a matter of weeks, the Allied soldiers had been pushed all the way back to the Egyptian border. But in the retreat, a division of Australian troops had been cut off by the Germans in the Libyan port of Tobruk. The British commander, Sir Archibald Wavell, now launched 2 successive attempts to relieve them. Both were fought off by Rommel's now well-encamped troops. The Germans massively outgunned the British. Their 88mm anti-aircraft guns, when used against tanks, far outranged the British. Moreover, Rommel took advantage of the wide-open landscape to drive his tanks around the British forces, outflanking them time and time again. It would become his trademark tactic. The British press, half grudgingly, half admiringly, nicknamed Rommel the Desert Fox. For Wavell, it was too much. Now exhausted, he was replaced by General Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck came under immediate pressure to try again to relieve the Allied troops in Tobruk. But he refused until his forces had been reinforced. Then, on November the 18th, 1941, he launched a major assault. Operation Crusader, as it was called, started with a lengthy armored dogfight. Again, the British tanks suffered heavy casualties. But the infantry slowly moved forward. Finally, after a month of confused fighting, Rommel retreated. Tobruk had been relieved. The Axis units fell back along the coast, all the way to their starting point at El Agheila. Auchinleck's military command now assumed Rommel was a spent force, at least for the time being. Its units were dispersed to bases along the coast, for a badly needed refit. It was a mistake. Two months later, in January 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps was back on the attack. It quickly brushed aside the forward units of a now unprepared British army. The chase along the coast of Africa began all over again. The Allies fell back towards a new defensive line just west of Tobruk. Here, a series of defensive positions, known as the Gazala Line, were constructed. Rommel attacked it at the end of May 1942. Once again, he swung his armour around the British forces in a great outflanking movement and came in behind the British positions. But this time the British were prepared for it and tried in turn to outflank Rommel. The fighting lasted for 3 weeks as each side tried to outmaneuver the other. Eventually, the British were forced to retreat. 3 days later, the Germans overran the Allied positions. Rommel pressed home his advantage. The British withdrawal threatened to become a rout. Finally, Auchinleck turned to face his enemy at the Egyptian village of El Alamein. His southern flank rested on the Qattara Depression, an area impassable to tanks. On July the 1st, 1942, Rommel attacked again. But this time, the British defences held. Rommel, with his supply lines stretched and now seriously short of fuel, was forced to give up. Now Auchinleck attempted a counterattack. For the rest of July, the two sides pushed at each other like exhausted boxers. Churchill was furious at the lack of British progress and now visited Egypt. It was time for yet another change of leadership. Auchinleck was replaced by not one, but two generals. General Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief near East, and General Bernard Montgomery as commander of 8th Army. The British and Axis forces had fought each other to a standstill. There was no clear winner, and the fate of North Africa still hung in the balance. Everything would now depend on whether the British could throttle the Axis supply routes across the Mediterranean. For the first months of World War II, the Allies had enjoyed unchallenged control of the Mediterranean Sea. Britain's oil supplies from the Middle East passed through it undisturbed, and communications with the Empire in India and the Far East were secure. Italy's entry into the war changed all that. Its naval fleet was modern and well equipped. The Italians now concentrated their fire on the strategically crucial British-controlled island of Malta. The island was an important refueling base for British submarines and aircraft in the eastern Mediterranean. It had become the center for Royal Navy attacks on Italian and German supply convoys to North Africa. In summer 1940, Italy bombed it. It was the beginning of a 2-year assault, which would inflict terrible suffering on the island's population. Yet for all Malta's strategic significance, Britain was caught on the hop. There were no fighter aircraft on the island to beat off the attacks. Then, almost by accident, 4 Gladiator fighter biplanes were found in crates on the island. They were hastily assembled. The aircraft put up a fierce resistance. For 3 weeks, the fate of Malta remained uncertain. Then, finally, British fighter reinforcements arrived, and the Italian bombers were temporarily beaten off. But it was now obvious to the British that they had to do something if they were to keep a toehold in the region. That winter, Britain launched what it hoped would be a knockout blow against the Italian Navy. On the evening of November the 11th, 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers lifted off an aircraft carrier. They swept in on the Italian fleet, anchored in its base at Taranto. The Italians hadn't expected it. Three of Italy's 6 battleships were crippled. 4 months later, Britain struck again. The Italian fleet was again caught off guard off the coast of Greece. A 4th Italian battleship was damaged. Mussolini's challenge to the British Navy was finished. It was a turning point for Hitler, too. It was now clear that Italy could no longer be depended on to maintain control of the Mediterranean. It meant his supply lines to North Africa were at risk of being cut off. Germany decided to take a direct hand. In early 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed Malta. The island took another severe battering. The attacks continued, month after month. Yet the British garrison hung on. During an interlude in the German bombardment in autumn 1941, it even managed to step up its attacks on the Axis supply convoys to North Africa. Then the Luftwaffe resumed the assault. But despite the battering, the people of Malta held on. The following spring, in April 1942, they received a unique honor for the heroism they had shown under 4 months of devastating Axis bombardment. The island was awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest award for civilian courage. But by the summer of 1942, Malta was running short of supplies and ammunition. In mid-June, the British Navy sent convoys from Gibraltar and Egypt to relieve it. But the Germans were waiting. Just 2 of the 17 ships got through. The situation on the island was getting desperate. It was time for some decisive action. In August, Britain launched Operation Pedestal, the biggest convoy ever sent to Malta. 14 merchant ships entered the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. They were accompanied by a large naval escort. Almost immediately, they ran into German opposition. For 3 days, there was a ferocious sea battle as Axis submarines and aircraft attempted to stop and sink the convoy. Finally, on the 4th day, 5 of the British merchant ships made it into port. They brought with them just enough supplies to keep the island going. Malta had been rescued. It meant the Allies could continue to harass the Axis supply lines to North Africa. It was a strategic advantage that would prove crucial to future events in the region. In North Africa, Churchill's orders to his new team, Generals Alexander and Montgomery, were simple. Destroy the army commanded by Field Marshal Rommel. Almost immediately they were informed by the team that had broken Germany's Enigma code that Rommel was preparing to attack them. Montgomery assumed the Desert Fox would try another of his outflanking moves and fortified the ridge of Alam Halfa, just to the southeast of El Alamein. It was, he hoped, the rock on which the Axis forces would be broken. When it came, the fighting lasted for 3 days. This time, Allied ground forces were helped by air power. The RAF played havoc with the advancing German tanks. Rommel was forced to give up, and, short of fuel again, he pulled back. It was now Rommel's turn to dig in. He chose a line between the impassable sand sea of the Qattara Depression and the Mediterranean coast. Great belts of minefields were covered by artillery. Rommel's panzer divisions were held back as a mobile reserve to destroy any Allied breakthroughs. Montgomery was well aware it was a formidable barrier. He also knew it was impossible to outflank it. His only option was to punch his way directly through the middle of the Axis defenses. He was helped by a flood of new equipment from the United States, which included the new American Lee and Sherman tanks with 75mm guns. At last, the Allies had a weapon which could match the Germans. Finally, on the evening of October the 23rd, 1942, the British opened up an artillery bombardment on Rommel's positions. The Battle of El Alamein had begun. Under cover of the bombardment, Allied engineers moved forward to clear paths through the Axis minefields. British, Australian, New Zealand and South African divisions fought to drive a hole through Rommel's defences. Rommel's artillery took a terrible toll. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Axis forces were harried by Allied air power. Finally, after 10 days of fighting, the Allied forces broke through. The following day, Rommel retreated. It was Germany's first major defeat at the hands of the Western Allies. Churchill was triumphant.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
For 2.5 months, Montgomery chased Rommel west along the North African coast towards Tunisia. Meanwhile, an Anglo-American force had landed 1,000 miles to his rear in French North Africa, Morocco and Algeria today. It was codenamed Operation Torch. The Allied First Army was soon moving eastwards towards Tunisia. Rommel was in danger of being attacked from behind. Over the next few days, the Germans flew in tens of thousands of troops from Europe to save Rommel and shore up the German position in North Africa. Finally, in late February 1943, Rommel, reinforced, set up a new defensive line 100 miles inside Tunisia and turned to attack Montgomery's advancing forces. But Montgomery had been forewarned by the Enigma codebreakers, and his troops were waiting as the German tanks rolled forward. British artillery broke up the assault, and the panzers were quickly halted. It was Rommel's last battle in North Africa. He now returned to Germany to beg Hitler to abandon the North African campaign. But Hitler refused. It was a misjudgment. As Montgomery's 8th Army now pushed up from the south, the Anglo-American First Army squeezed in from the west. On May the 7th, US forces took the port of Bizerta. The British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, drove into Tunis. The Allies' pincer closed, and the Axis troops were trapped. 5 days later, 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered. It was more than twice the number that had surrendered at Stalingrad 4 months earlier. For Germany, it was another momentous disaster. The following day, the British Regional Commander-in-Chief, General Harold Alexander, signalled Winston Churchill, "Sir, it is my duty to report that all enemy resistance has ceased. We are the masters of the North African shores." Mussolini's gamble in North Africa had taken a terrible toll on German resources. It was about to have even more serious consequences for both him and Germany. In January 1943, at a conference in the Moroccan city of Casablanca, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to open a new front on German-dominated Europe. The obvious target was Italy, seriously weakened by its North African failures. The only question was, where should the invasion begin? Should the route go via Sardinia or Sicily? The Allied High Command chose the Sicilian route, but to throw the Germans off the scent, they organized a deception plan. Operation Mincemeat was launched. A corpse was dropped off the shores of Spain carrying false papers. When it was washed ashore in May 1943 and the papers passed to the Germans, they revealed that the Allies would pretend to attack Sicily, but that their real target was Sardinia. Enigma code breakers soon confirmed the Germans had fallen for it. Six weeks later, the British 8th Army, under Montgomery, landed in the southeast corner of Sicily. The Italian coastal troops presented few problems. Further west, the US 7th Army landed in the Gulf of Gela. The Italian resistance was again overwhelmed. For the Italian people, the invasion of Sicily was the final humiliation. Mussolini was overthrown in a popular uprising. The new government now opened secret talks with the Allies for an armistice. For Hitler, it was another nightmare. He was now forced to pour in yet more scarce resources to protect his southern flank. He told his commanders that even if Italy surrendered, they should fight on. Within 5 weeks, the Germans had been pushed out of Sicily. The Allies now crossed to the mainland and pushed up through the country. US troops moved up the west side. British troops moved up the east. The Germans fought back savagely all the way. Even so, Naples fell to the Allies on October the 1st, 1943. But then their progress was slowed by autumn rains and skillful German rearguard attacks. It was not until the end of November that Allied forces finally reached the Gustav Line, the first of a series of German defensive positions cutting across Italy. British troops managed to break through at the eastern end of the line, but winter was setting in, and bad weather forced them to halt. Nevertheless, in the west, US forces attempted to outflank the German defenses by taking to the sea. They landed on January the 22nd, 1944, 60 miles to the north at the point of Anzio. But here, amidst fierce fighting, they were pinned down and nearly driven back into the sea. The Americans remained trapped at Anzio for the rest of the winter and into the spring. Meanwhile, in the center of Italy, the key to breaking the Gustav Line was the towering Monte Cassino mountain complex. As spring came, there was a series of attempts to capture it. Each assault failed. In desperation, the Allies bombed the historic monastery on the summit. But the Germans hung on. Finally, in late spring 1944, as the weather improved, the Allied forces broke through the German lines. Simultaneously, the Americans broke out of Anzio. The Allied forces now moved swiftly north to Rome. The Italian capital was liberated on June the 4th, 1944. For Hitler, it was another blow. He was now hanging on to Italy by his fingernails. The Allies continued to push north. The German defenders finally fell back to the formidable Gothic line, just north of Florence. Here, bad weather again brought the Allied advance to a halt. It wouldn't be until the spring of 1945 that the campaign could resume and Italy was finally won. By then, the Italians had had enough of Mussolini. He was captured by Italian partisan forces and shot. His corpse was hung by its heels in Milan. Mussolini's war had been a catastrophe for himself and his country. It had also left the German southern flank dangerously exposed. The German army was now overcommitted, short of troops, and retreating on all fronts. As World War II got underway, both the Allies and the Germans were looking for the knockout blow, the new weapon that would decisively defeat the enemy. For Hitler's Germany, the problem was that Britain was an island. His tanks couldn't blitzkrieg across the Channel. The only way to defeat her was to strangle her seaborne supply routes. That meant warships, and above all, submarines. For the Western Allies, the problem was attacking Germany when there were no Allied troops in mainland Europe. The solution they adopted was strategic bombing. Aerial bombardment aimed at destroying Germany's infrastructure and pounding its people into submission. The two sides had adopted two very different tactics, but with one aim: to save their troops and to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. Ironically, it was the Germans who first started strategic bombing. In August 1940, Luftwaffe bombers accidentally hit London. The RAF retaliated by bombing Berlin. By the autumn, Germany was bombing Britain's cities almost daily, convinced the British would eventually crack. But the Blitz, as it was called, never showed any sign of forcing the British to surrender. And by the summer of 1941, it was dying away as the Luftwaffe turned its attention to the war in Russia. But for the British military command, bombing remained the only way of striking directly at Hitler's Germany. Moreover, by early 1941, the RAF was starting to receive a new generation of bigger, more powerful, four-engined bombers. These could carry loads of up to 18,000 pounds of bombs, 4 times the capacity of earlier aircraft. The first of these was the Short Stirling. To begin with, the plan was not to hit the German population, but specific infrastructure targets, cutting transport and oil supplies, damaging Germany's ability to wage war. But it suffered one central problem. Britain's bombing was extremely inaccurate. In August 1941, a secret British report showed that over the crucial German Ruhr industrial area, only 10% of British bombers were getting their bombs within 5 miles of their target. At the same time, the German air defenses were taking a terrible toll on British planes. By late 1941, up to 10% of the bombers on any raid were being shot down. A loss rate which couldn't be sustained. The Royal Air Force High Command decided to change tactics. It gave up any pretense of trying to hit specific targets. Instead, Bomber Command was instructed to undertake what it called area bombing, a euphemism for what is known today as carpet bombing. The idea was to deliberately target an entire area of a city, regardless of the civilian population. In the chilling words of the British Air Ministry, it would destroy the morale of the civilian population and, in particular, of industrial workers. Its leading exponent was Air Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, who was now appointed Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
In spring 1942, Harris launched what was, in effect, a huge public relations stunt for what he preferred to call strategic bombing. He gathered every available aircraft in Bomber Command. Over 1,000 took off for the German city of Cologne. The city's defenses were overwhelmed. 600 acres were destroyed. But only 39 British aircraft were lost. Harris had won his point. He now had the full support of the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He also now had an outstanding new weapon, the Avro Lancaster, the finest heavy night bomber of the war. And he had a new partner. By the summer of 1942, the United States had joined the air war in Europe. American planes began to appear in Britain. The majority were the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It was heavily armed with 13 machine guns and could, in theory, fight its way through to a target in daylight without a fighter escort. It was also equipped with a new bomb sight that would supposedly allow it to drop its bombs with almost unerring precision. These features encouraged the Americans to ignore the lessons of the early British campaign and return to targeted raids on Germany's infrastructure. In August 1942, the Americans put the Flying Fortress to the test. 12 of them attacked marshalling yards near Rouen in France. Damage was slight, but the United States lost no aircraft. For the Americans, it was the proof that daylight raids on infrastructure targets could work. For the British, it simply showed that the Americans could hit a minor and relatively undefended target. But that winter, the two allies agreed to combine their approaches. They would launch a massive bombing campaign against Germany's industrial heartland. The Americans would attack by day against carefully selected infrastructure targets. The British would attack by night, carpet bombing whole areas, destroying war production and civilian morale. They hoped it would be so devastating, it might even bring the war to an end. In March 1943, British planes took off for the German industrial city of Essen. High-speed Mosquito light bombers went in first, dropping flares to highlight the targets. Then a force of nearly 450 Lancaster bombers swept over the city, dropping their loads. The German defenses were overpowered. Only 14 British aircraft were shot down. The Essen raid was followed by wave after wave of similar attacks on industrial towns in the Ruhr. But the German air defenses now began to get the measure of the Allied attacks. Britain's losses climbed to 1 in 10. Harris was forced, reluctantly, to call a halt to the attacks. But then he was informed about a new Allied invention. Codenamed Window, it consisted of clouds of aluminium foil strips dropped from an aircraft. As the foil fell, it jammed any radar system. It promised to cripple the German air defenses. Harris seized on it, and 4 months after the Essen raid, in July 1943, he went back on the offensive. He called it Operation Gomorrah. The target this time was the industrial port of Hamburg. Bombers equipped with Window jammed the German radar. Other aircraft dropped incendiary bombs. A giant firestorm engulfed the city center. "40,000 people died, and 500,000 were made homeless. More raids on the port followed. It was an enormous shock to the German people. Four months later, in the autumn of 1943, Harris followed Hamburg with a series of attacks on Berlin. But by now the Germans were learning to overcome the effect of Window, and by spring 1944, British losses were back at nearly 1 plane in 10. Worse, there was no sign German civilian morale was cracking. Harris's carpet bombing campaign was just not working. But neither was the American alternative of targeting infrastructure. By the spring of 1943, US Army Air Force daylight raids were steadily reaching deeper into Germany. But American losses were climbing. Around 1 in every 15 planes was being shot down. Yet undaunted, the American command now launched an attack on factories in the German towns of Regensburg and Schweinfurt. It was hugely ambitious. Both were deep in southern Germany, far beyond the range of US escort fighters. It was a disaster. The 380 flying fortresses, which US bomber chiefs had assured everybody wouldn't need a fighter escort, were harried and shot down. The loss rate was over 16%. The US was forced to suspend its bombing campaign. The war in the air had reached stalemate, and there was still no sign of it helping to usher in a victory. Then, in the early summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared to invade mainland Europe, the British and American air forces were tasked with disrupting German communication lines and oil supplies. It represented a return to targeted infrastructure bombing. But this time, the Allies had a new weapon. The British had experimentally modified a US fighter, the P-51 Mustang. The US engine had been replaced by a British-made Rolls-Royce Merlin. It gave the plane a much longer range. It was the ideal long-distance bomber escort. The Allied bombers hit bridges and roads leading to the German front in France with almost surgical precision. Oil supplies to the German military were drastically reduced. Once again, the German fighters attacked, but they were now outmaneuvered by the Mustang. Much of the German Air Force, now running low on fuel, was grounded. The campaign of targeted bombing on Germany's infrastructure may not have been the knockout blow the Allies hoped for, but it was finally paying dividends. But one man was not impressed. Bomber Harris was still obsessed with the idea that ever more devastating carpet bombing attacks would stop Germany in her tracks once and for all. So it was that in late 1944, Britain returned to carpet bombing. German city after city was hit and devastated. Then, in February 1945, Harris attacked Dresden, a city with virtually no military significance. The city's civilian population had been inflated by refugees fleeing bombing raids elsewhere. Yet Harris seems to have had no regard for civilian life. The city was flattened. Some 50,000 people died. It was a raid too far. Finally, questions began to be asked about the morality, let alone the efficacy, of carpet bombing. Whatever it had achieved, it had been done at an horrendous cost of civilian and military lives. Critically, it had failed to break German morale, yet 60% of RAF crews had died before they had completed 30 missions. For all the hopes put in it, carpet bombing had not come up with the knockout blow. The Germans, meanwhile, had put their faith in an altogether different technology to give them the knockout blow they needed to win the war. For Germany, Britain was a problem. It was an island, and for once Hitler's formidable land forces were useless. Britain also had a much more powerful navy. Yet Hitler calculated that if he used what he had strategically, he could fatally disrupt the sea convoys that were keeping Britain supplied with everything from oil to food. In the first 18 months of the war, German raiders sank more than 130 British merchant vessels. Some of the most effective raiders were the so-called pocket battleships, small but powerful warships designed in the 1930s to circumvent restrictions imposed on German rearmament after World War I. One, the Graf Spee, became particularly notorious. In a matter of weeks, she sank 9 Allied merchant ships in the South Atlantic before being cornered off the River Plate in South America and Scotland. But the raids were taking a serious toll. If the losses continued to rise, Britain would have real supply problems. Then, in early spring 1941, Germany's first and only 2 full-sized battleships completed their sea trials. They sent a shiver through the British Navy. Their potential for destruction was enormous. First into action was the Bismarck. In May, RAF reconnaissance aircraft spotted her in the Norwegian port of Bergen, trying to sneak out into the North Atlantic. The British Navy set off in pursuit. 2 days later, the Bismarck was sighted in the North Atlantic. Britain's latest battleship, the Prince of Wales, was sent to intercept her. With her was the British battlecruiser, Hood. Early on May the 24th, 1941, the 2 forces met. It was the first time the 2 sides' battleships had squared up to each other. Almost immediately, a shell from the Bismarck plunged through the weak deck armor of the Hood. It penetrated one of the aft magazines. There was a huge explosion. Only 3 of the Hood's 1,200 crew survived. The Prince of Wales, now outnumbered, retreated. It was round 1 to the Bismarck. 2 days later, Bismarck was spotted again, this time far to the south, several hundred miles off the coast of France. British Swordfish torpedo bombers swooped in. One hit and jammed the Bismarck's rudder. The following morning, 2 British battleships, the Rodney and King George V, caught up with the crippled Bismarck. They started pouring heavy caliber shells onto the hapless German ship. She was soon reduced to a blazing wreck. Bismarck was finally sunk by a torpedo. All but 110 of her 2,300 crew perished. The Bismarck had been sunk before she'd had a chance to prove her worth. Then, in June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The war at sea entered a new phase. Britain began sending supply convoys to the Russian Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Immediately, the German Navy prepared to cut them off. Convoy after convoy was attacked or threatened. By summer 1943, it had become so dangerous, further convoys to Russia were suspended until the autumn, when it was hoped bad weather and poor visibility would offer some protection. While the convoys were suspended, Britain turned its attention to one of the biggest threats it faced, the Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz. She'd spent months hiding in the Norwegian fjords, waiting for the moment to pounce. All the while, the British Navy had been keeping her under close watch, determined to eliminate Germany's last battleship. In September 1943, 5 British midget submarines known as X-craft were sent into the Norwegian fjords to sink her. The attack caused only minor damage. By the following spring, the Tirpitz was once again ready to menace the Arctic convoys. The Royal Navy now sent in a massive force to attack her. It included 6 aircraft carriers. They took the Germans completely by surprise. British dive bombers attacked Tirpitz. But she was heavily armored, and the relatively small bombs caused only superficial damage. 3 months later, she was ready for action again. She was soon spotted in another Norwegian fjord. Lancaster bombers carrying massive 5-ton tallboy bombs were sent in to sink her once and for all. Tirpitz put up a smokescreen, which partially obscured her. Nevertheless, several bombs struck her bow, causing severe damage. Finally, 2 months later, a squadron of Lancaster bombers caught her in perfect weather conditions. 3 tall boys struck home. Tirpitz slowly capsized. Almost 1,000 crew members went down with her. After more than 2 years of hiding and running from the British Navy, she had been sunk. Germany's battleships had promised much, but against the overwhelming might of the British Navy, they'd never had a chance to prove their worth. Hitler had lost the battle at sea, at least on the surface. But below the waves, it was a different story. Germany's military planners had long expected that the country's U-boat fleet would play a key role in cutting Britain's supply lines. They could sneak up underwater on British merchant vessels, attacking them at the last moment. The submarines were also extremely agile on the surface. To combat the threat, Britain's merchant fleet was corralled into convoys for protection. But there was a serious shortage of anti-submarine ships to escort them. Many ships sailed without protection. Yet Britain's naval command remained remarkably complacent. They believed they had the weapons and the technology to contain the U-boat threat. It was soon proved wrong. In the early months of the war, Britain's supply lines were harassed and disrupted. Often the U-boats would attack on the surface, picking off merchant ships with their deck guns. In response, the Royal Navy sent aircraft carriers equipped with submarine hunting aircraft to patrol the sea lanes used by the convoys. But they had only limited effect. By the end of 1939, over 100 Allied merchant ships had been sunk by German submarines. If losses continued at this rate, Britain would face disaster. Oil, food, and weapons would all begin to run short. Then things got even more difficult. Germany overran France. Suddenly, the German Navy, which until now had been largely bottled up in the North Sea, had access to France's Atlantic seaboard. They now had a base to attack Britain's Atlantic convoys. France's Atlantic ports filled with newly built German U-boats, particularly the Type 7C ocean-going vessel. Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the German U-boat service, now organized his submarines into what he called wolf packs. A group would be lined up across a likely convoy route. As soon as one U-boat spotted a convoy, it called in the rest to attack. Sometimes the U-boats were also guided by long-range patrol aircraft. By the end of October 1940, up to 40% of Allied merchant shipping per convoy was being sunk. Britain's supplies were under threat. German U-boat crews called it the Happy Time, and top U-boat commanders became national heroes. Britain was paying dearly for its lack of preparation. But finally, things began to change. A crash-building program of anti-submarine escort vessels was producing results. The first corvettes, as they were known, were coming off the slipways. For the first time, Britain could set up permanent groups of warships to escort the supply convoys. But their effectiveness was limited by the fact that their top speed was 15 knots, 2 knots slower than the surface speed of a U-boat. At the same time, the patrol aircraft of Britain's Coastal Command were equipped with depth charges. They lacked the range to cover the mid-Atlantic, but U-boats on the surface near their bases could be harried and forced to submerge. Then, as in the bombing campaigns, it was a series of technological breakthroughs that really came to Britain's help. In early 1940, a new type of radar, known as centimetric radar, was developed. It was smaller than existing systems, and for the first time could be fitted to escort ships and aircraft. Now, any German U-boat on the surface was vulnerable. Some months later, there was a second technological breakthrough. Huff-Duff was a radio detector. Anytime a German U-boat surfaced to communicate, Huff-Duff could pick up the radio signal and pinpoint its exact position. Steadily, during the spring of 1941, Britain began to contain the U-boat threat. Merchant shipping losses fell by more than half. In early March, Gunther Prien, one of Germany's top U-boat commanders, failed to return from a patrol. Shortly afterwards, 2 more top German U-boat commanders lost their lives in quick succession. Then Germany suffered a major disaster that would reverberate through the rest of the war. In May 1941, the British destroyer Bulldog forced U-110 to the surface and captured the submarine. On board was an Enigma machine used for encoding German signals. More importantly, Bulldog also captured the naval code books that went with the machine. It would provide vital assistance to Britain's code breakers. Soon, unbeknown to the Germans, Britain was getting a real insight into German naval communications. For the Royal Navy, it meant convoys could now be routed away from the U-boat wolfpacks. Germany's submarines had to work harder and search further to find and sink their prey. Yet, despite the Allied gains, by the winter of 1941, the German war machine was producing ever greater numbers of U-boats. The long-term outlook for Britain's supply routes still looked ominous. Then, in December 1941, the war at sea changed decisively. In December 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States. Almost immediately, Admiral Dönitz, head of the German U-boat service, sent submarines to attack US merchant shipping along the American seaboard. At first, only a few of his submarines, the new Type 9, were capable of making the long voyage from Europe. They found easy pickings. The US Navy's Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Ernest King, had resisted British advice to corral his merchant ships into convoys. Over a 3-month period, more than 400 US merchant ships were sunk or destroyed. America was learning the tough lesson Britain had already learnt. Something had to be done. King now changed his mind, and by May 1942, the United States had introduced a limited system of convoys. By July, the US losses were falling. It forced the Germans to adopt a new tactic. They would concentrate their U-boats in one particular part of the North Atlantic, the Black Gap, the area in mid-ocean too far from land for anti-submarine aircraft to reach. Often a convoy would be hit by more than 15 submarines coming at it in waves. During October 1942, 56 Allied ships were sunk in the Black Gap. By the following March, Allied losses had reached 120 ships in a single month. During the same month, the Germans lost only 12 U-boats. Hitler's tactic of disrupting Britain's supply lines so severely the country would collapse seemed a real possibility. It looked as though his U-boats might win him the war. But now the Allies began to up their game. Britain had brought in a new commander. Admiral Max Horton was former head of the Royal Navy's submarine fleet. His first move was to set up permanent groups of destroyers and frigates that would provide additional support to convoys, rushing in as soon as an enemy wolf pack was spotted. Equally importantly, a string of yet more technological developments came on stream. The Hedgehog was an anti-submarine mortar that fired 24 bombs. Allied aircraft were fitted with a new high-powered searchlight, the Lee light. As an aircraft swooped in, it could be turned on at the last moment, catching a submarine by surprise on the surface. The steady technological advance now began to pay off. The German U-boat losses increased. The German commander, Admiral Dönitz, struggled to regain the initiative. In April, he ordered an all-out U-boat attack on convoy ONS-5, a convoy of 43 merchant ships traveling from Liverpool to Canada. It was designed to be a demonstration of German naval force. 40 U-boats descended on the convoy. The British sent in extra support groups. Anti-submarine aircraft flew from Canada. It would take 4 days for the Allies to beat off the German attack. 11 merchant ships were sunk, but the Germans had lost 7 U-boats. Two weeks later, Dönitz tried again, attacking a second convoy. It was a disaster. 5 U-boats were sunk without a single merchant ship being lost. During May 1943, a quarter of all Germany's operational U-boats was sunk. The Germans were finally beginning to lose the U-boat war in the Atlantic. So the Allies now took the battle to the Germans. A new long-range version of the US B-24 Liberator bomber was introduced. It could now reach the German U-boats in the Black Gap. Germany's submarine designers tried to respond with innovations of their own. U-boats were fitted with radar detectors and anti-aircraft guns. Some were also fitted with the Dutch-designed schnorkel, an air inlet that meant that submarines could spend longer underwater, hidden from Allied radar. But it was too little, too late. The Allies still found them. Hitler's U-boats were now pinned down in port. It was too dangerous for them to roam the ocean freely. German attempts to find an answer became increasingly desperate. They now produced a revolutionary new submarine. It was known as the Type 21. It was electric-powered and capable of 17 knots while submerged, over twice the speed of a traditional submarine and fast enough to outrun most surface vessels. But again, it was too late. Only one ever became operational, and it never made contact with the enemy. By the end of 1943, the Allies dominated the Atlantic. It was a turning point in the war. Hitler's U-boat campaign had taken a terrible toll on both sides. The Germans lost nearly 800 submarines. 75% of the U-boat crews perished. On the Allied side, some 32,000 sailors died. But now, at last, with the U-boats out of the way, great waves of US troops and equipment could flood across the ocean in preparation for the invasion of Europe. Victory in the Battle of the Atlantic would fundamentally change the course of the war. summer 1943, and on the Eastern Front, Hitler's armies were in retreat. Huge Soviet artillery barrages and tank assaults were shredding the German lines. Hitler, by now, was fighting a war on two fronts. In Western Europe, an Anglo-American force was moving up through Italy, menacing his southern flank. The Germans had been forced to pull some of their elite troops back from the Eastern Front to help. It left their forces in the east dangerously overstretched. The exhausted German soldiers were up against the enormous reserves of the huge Soviet military machine. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, now seized this opportunity to wreak his revenge and move onto the offensive. By early August 1943, the Red Army had driven the Germans from the cities of Orel and Belgorod. To celebrate the victories, Stalin ordered 12 124-gun salvos and a barrage of fireworks in Moscow's Red Square. He proclaimed, "Eternal glory to the heroes who fell in the struggle for freedom. Death to the German invaders." In Germany, Hitler's response was to take greater personal control of all important military decisions. The effects were felt almost immediately by Axis troops occupying the strategically important city of Kharkov. The Soviet forces approached the city from three sides. The German commander, Erich von Manstein, ordered a tactical withdrawal. Hitler immediately countermanded it. Kharkov should be held at all costs. Hitler would not accept anything that would reduce what he called Lebensraum, the land he believed Germany needed to ensure its greatness. Just as importantly, he also believed Germany would win the war, if not by numbers, then by the sheer will to win. The Germans dug in. At first, it seemed to work. For several days, repeated Soviet assaults were repulsed. More than 300 Russian T-34 tanks were destroyed. But by the end of August 1943, the German positions had been overrun. Eventually, Manstein went against his Führer. He ordered his men to get out. The Red Army drove into the ruins of Kharkov the next day. It marked the beginning of a massive Soviet offensive along a 1,500-mile front. It stretched from Rostov in the south to Smolensk in the north. At the southern end of the front, near Rostov, a Russian breakthrough threatened to trap pockets of German soldiers in the Crimea. Once again, Manstein asked permission to withdraw. All he got was a message from Hitler. Don't do anything. I am coming myself. But he never did. The German military was forced into another last-minute, chaotic retreat. The withdrawal was made worse by bands of battle-hardened partisans. Many were former Red Army soldiers who had been cut off behind enemy lines. They now ambushed the retreating Germans, cutting their communication and supply lines. The Germans responded with predictable ferocity. There were savage reprisals against the civilian population. The Germans also launched a scorched earth policy. Factories, power plants, railways and bridges were all blown up. A massive hydroelectric dam, which provided electricity for the whole of the Ukraine, was wrecked. Meanwhile, in the center of the front, the Germans fell back across the river Dnieper. As they fled, they blew up yet more bridges, turning the river into a formidable defensive line. They then dug in along the west bank. Stalin's response was to offer the Soviet Union's highest award to the first Red Army soldier to cross the river. By the early autumn 1943, a number of small Soviet bridgeheads had been established on the German-controlled West Bank. But they met determined German resistance. Fighting raged along the Dnieper throughout October 1943. Finally, at the beginning of November, Soviet troops captured Kiev. All along the river, the Germans were pushed out of their defensive positions and forced to retreat still further west. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had virtually cleared the Germans out of Russia's historic homeland. They were now moving west across the Ukraine. The countries of Europe were in their sights. By spring 1944, Hitler's armies were in full retreat. The Soviet leadership now poured in ever greater quantities of men and equipment. The Germans had two excellent tanks, the Tiger I and the Panzer Mark V Panther. Both were well suited to the sort of mobile defensive warfare which was the only remaining hope for the German armies on the Eastern Front. But the Red Army had at least twice as many tanks, mostly the battle-tried T-34, and armament factories in Siberia were turning out more at a rate of 2,000 a month. While Hitler was forced to divide his forces between a war on two fronts, Stalin's war machine was working flat out. 6 million Soviet troops faced less than 3 million Germans. In early January 1944, the forces of the First Ukrainian Front moved in from the north on the German-held town of Korsun. It was the last German toehold on what they'd hoped would be their defensive line along the river Dnieper. 12 days later, the forces of the Second Ukrainian Front drove forward on the southern side. The attack followed a by now well-established Soviet pattern. First, there was a build-up of an overwhelming number of troops. The Germans were never quite sure where the first assault would come from. Then there was a devastating artillery bombardment. Next, the massed tanks of the Red Army would punch a hole through the German defenses. Finally, the infantry poured in. In Korsun, it quickly became obvious to the Germans they were about to be overwhelmed. The German commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to beg, yet again, for permission to pull out. But Hitler once more refused. After a week of fierce fighting, about 60,000 men were trapped in what became known as the Korsun pocket. The Soviets called it Little Stalingrad. The German forces now attempted to break out. But the Russians were ready for it. T-34 tanks and Cossack horsemen harried the Germans as they tried to escape. The fighting lasted 2 days. By the time Korsun fell, the Germans had lost some 30,000 men. The Red Army forces were now moving forward at speed. Their advance was made possible by fleets of trucks, mostly provided by the United States, that kept their forces supplied. It was a much faster process than for the Germans, who still relied heavily on horses. The Russians were also dominating the skies. The Luftwaffe had always been a key part of the German war machine. But Hitler had been forced to divert many of his aircraft to defend the homeland from a US and British bomber offensive. As a result, Russian planes outnumbered the Luftwaffe 5-1. The Red Air Force's Sturmwik fighter bombers took a heavy toll on German armor and supply columns. Yet Hitler refused to contemplate defeat, and now announced a new version of his no-retreat policy. He ordered the German troops to create what he called fortified areas, or local strongholds. These were to be defended to the bitter end. Only with his personal approval could any of these fortresses be abandoned. It was a desperate ploy, and would come to cost the Germans dearly. One of the first tests of the new strategy was near the Ukrainian town of Kamenets-Podolsky. Here, 20 divisions of panzers were threatened with being cut off. But Hitler declared it a fortified area and refused to allow a retreat. In the face of bitter fighting, there was a vitriolic argument between Hitler and Manstein, who could see the writing on the wall. Finally, Manstein got his way, and the panzers were given permission to break out. Ten days later, some 200,000 men of the 1st Panzer Army safely reached the German lines over 100 miles to the west. But they had lost most of their heavy equipment and weapons. By now, Manstein's requests to retreat had become too much for Hitler. The field marshal was sacked. Further south, the Germans attempted to hold back the Soviet torrent on the Yezhny Bug River. They failed, and a large force of Germans was caught behind Russian lines in the Black Sea port of Odessa. They too faced being cut off. In early April 1944, Hitler declared it a fortress. But the German troops ignored him and slipped out of the city. Several days later, on April the 10th, Odessa was liberated. Stalin was winning on all fronts. He could now turn his attention to the northern Russian city that had suffered under Nazi assault for years. By the beginning of 1944, the Russian city of Leningrad had been under siege from German forces for nearly 2.5 years. During the first winter, almost 500,000 people had starved to death. Volunteers struggled to put out fires and construct defenses. But by 1944, life in the city had become almost unbearable. Several attempts to relieve it had failed. One effort in 1942 led to the capture of more than 50,000 troops of the Soviet Second Shock Army. Another, in 1943, had enabled a trickle of supplies to get into the city. But even so, throughout 1943, up to 20,000 people continued to die of cold, disease and starvation every month. By January 1944, however, with the Germans in headlong retreat, Stalin now turned his attention to the plight of the city. That month, Soviet forces secretly infiltrated the neighboring peninsula around Oranienburg. The attack on the German positions started with a savage 65-minute bombardment. Then Russian troops ripped into the startled German lines. At the same time, another Soviet force attacked from the northeast around the city. They too burst onto the German lines. For 3 days, the German commander, Field Marshal Georg von Köchler, held out. Finally, he asked Hitler for permission to fall back. Hitler, as always, refused. Köchler argued back, telling the Führer only a swift withdrawal would save his army from a massacre. Hitler sacked him. He was replaced by General Walter Mödel. He was known as Hitler's fireman for his fierce loyalty and avid Nazi outlook. But even to Mödel, the danger was obvious. He now disobeyed Hitler and pulled out. After 2.5 years, the siege of Leningrad was finally lifted. Nearly 1 million Russian civilians had died. Relief in the city was overwhelming. The first fallout was in neighboring pro-German Finland, which now feared a Soviet invasion. So in March 1944, a secret Finnish delegation arrived in Moscow to discuss peace. Stalin's terms were harsh. He demanded the Petsamo region in the far north of Finland, an area rich in nickel, an important ingredient in the manufacture of metal alloys. He also demanded reparations of $600 million. The Finns refused and prepared for a Soviet invasion. But Finland could wait. The Soviet High Command, or Stavka as it was known, had more pressing business further south. The Red Army offensives in the Ukraine in late 1943 had trapped 120,000 German troops in the Crimea. Hitler, as ever, had refused to allow them to withdraw. They now waited helplessly for a Soviet onslaught. In early April, 2 months after the lifting of the siege on Leningrad, it came. The troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front crashed into the Crimea from the north. At the same time, a diversionary attack landed on the eastern end of the peninsula. In less than a day, the Axis troops in the west had given way. They fell back on the port of Sebastopol, and Hitler ordered Fortress Sebastopol to hold out to the last man. They didn't stand a chance. Within 2 weeks of the siege, German troops were being evacuated by sea. 40,000 men escaped, but some 30,000 defenders were still trapped in the port. They retreated to the beaches south of the city, hoping to be rescued by more German ships. It didn't happen. The evacuation was interrupted by a Soviet artillery bombardment. Three days later, the Germans surrendered. Meanwhile, back in the northwest of the country, the Germans still occupied much of what is Belarus today. But the Red Army had grabbed a vast bulge of land stretching into Poland and Romania. It meant the Germans had to defend a 1,400-mile front. They were hugely overextended. Military logic suggested it was time for the Germans to withdraw to more manageable defensive positions. But Hitler, still obsessed with territorial gain, refused to allow any further retreat. The German military would continue to pay a high price for Hitler's constant meddling and unrealistic ambitions. By the spring of 1944, Hitler's forces were stretched to their limit. All along the Eastern Front, there was a desperate need for reinforcements. The problem for the German High Command was where to place the few resources it had to maximum advantage. German intelligence reports suggested the next big Red Army offensive would be into Belarus. But Hitler disagreed. He was convinced Stalin would strike south and seize the Romanian oil fields. Both were wrong, at least to begin with. In the early summer, the Red Army Command finally turned its attention to Finland. Russian troops attacked across the Karelian Isthmus. After 2 days fighting, the Finns were forced to retreat. Slowly, over the next month, the Red Army advanced north into Finland. By August 1944, it was all over, and the Finns sued for peace. It was now that Stalin showed the first signs of a pattern that would be repeated across Europe. He seized land, in this case areas of Finnish Karelia and the nickel-rich Petsamo region. Next, Stalin's attention turned to Central Europe. In the summer of 1944, he launched what he called Operation Bagration, named after a Russian hero of the Napoleonic Wars. At 5 a.m. on June the 22nd, 3 years to the day after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the guns of the Red Army began a ferocious bombardment of German forces in what today is Belarus. It was exactly where, months earlier, German intelligence reports had suggested a Soviet attack would come. But because Hitler had ignored them, the area was poorly defended. It was another of his mistakes. The Germans were now being pounded along a 350-mile front. In some places, the Russians used over 400 guns for every mile. The barrage was followed, as always, by a torrent of Soviet tanks and infantry crashing into the German defenses. To make matters worse for the Germans, they had almost no air support. Much of the Luftwaffe was still tied up defending the German homeland. It was now that Hitler's folly of fighting a war on two fronts became all too apparent. The Red Air Force could operate almost unopposed. Russian planes struck deep behind German lines, cutting communications and harassing reinforcements. Within 36 hours, the German panzers had been swept aside. About 50,000 men faced encirclement in the German-held town of Vitebsk. Hitler, as had become routine, initially refused to let it retreat. Then, when on the following day he relented, it was too late for many of his troops. 4 days later, Vitebsk fell. 20,000 Axis troops were killed and 10,000 taken prisoner. Further south, along the Belarus front, the pattern was repeated. Hitler, now furious, sacked his general, Field Marshal Ernst Busch. Once again, he brought in his favorite, the now promoted Field Marshal Walter Mödel. But it made no difference. Town after town fell. The regional capital of Minsk was now within reach. Two days later, the Red Army encircled it. Over 100,000 German troops were trapped. Soviet forces bombarded. Within a week, the German survivors surrendered. The unstoppable Russian advance now pushed on to the Baltic states. First of all was the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Across the entire eastern front, the Germans were in retreat. But they left behind them towns and countryside laid waste. They committed widespread atrocities against local inhabitants. Nothing, however, could have prepared the Red Army for what it was about to discover. On July the 23rd, 1944, Soviet forces reached the small Polish village of Majdanek, near Lublin. Here they came across their first evidence of Hitler's final solution: the Majdanek extermination camp. It was a camp designed for the murder of Jews on an industrial scale. But as the first Soviet reports of what they'd found leaked out, the Western Allies simply dismissed them. Three days after seizing Majdanek, the Russians were approaching Warsaw. But here the Red Army paused. Stalin now stood ready to do what Hitler had done before: grab land, not in the name of Lebensraum, but of communism. By the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration had ripped the heart out of the German army in the east. more than 300,000 Axis soldiers had died. A 150,000 had been taken prisoner. The Red Army now paused and dug in along the river Vistula, south of Warsaw. Stalin was in no hurry to bring the war to an end. With Europe in turmoil, conditions were ideal for the spread of communism. The first victims of Stalin's political calculations were the Poles. On August 1st, 1944, the Polish Home Army rose up in Warsaw against its Nazi occupiers. But it desperately needed help. The Red Army, camped just to the south, was perfectly placed to provide it. But Stalin regarded the Polish Home Army as close to the Polish government in exile in London and hostile to communism. So he turned a blind eye to the plight of the Polish fighters. They were crushed with terrible brutality. The Germans wouldn't finally be pushed out of Poland until the Russian army drove them out in January 1945. It was the start of a Soviet master plan that would eventually see communist governments across most of Eastern Europe. To the north, contingents of the Red Army continued to clear the Germans out of the Baltic states. These would later be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Near the Latvian capital of Riga, over 200,000 Germans were trapped behind Russian lines. But Hitler, still determined to hold on to his Lebensraum, refused to countenance a retreat. Even so, gradually the German forces were pushed back to the Baltic coast. By mid-October 1944, the Germans had been squeezed onto the Courland Peninsula, west of Riga. They would remain marooned there for the rest of the war, when they eventually surrendered to Soviet forces. Stalin, meanwhile, was already sizing up other territory in Eastern Europe. He could have moved directly west towards Germany. Instead, units of the Red Army moved south in a vast thrust down through the Balkans. Nearly 1,500 tanks and 1 million men pushed into Romania in late August 1944. The defending Axis forces had less than 400 tanks and just 800,000 troops. Pro-German Romanian troops gave way almost immediately all along the front. 3 days later, large pockets of German troops were surrounded near Kishinev. Hitler issued his standard command: no retreat. For 9 days, there was bitter fighting. Over 180,000 German troops were killed or taken prisoner. The remainder beat a belated retreat. In late August, Romania's pro-German dictator, Marshal Ion Antonescu, was arrested. Romania surrendered. By the end of the month, the Red Army was in Bucharest and had occupied the strategically important Romanian oil fields. It meant Germany had lost its main supply of oil. 3 Soviet armies now moved south into Bulgaria. Bulgaria had tried to stay neutral, but it too would soon be swallowed up by the Soviet Empire. Meanwhile, the rest of the Russian forces now moved west towards Yugoslavia. German troops to the south, in Greece, faced being trapped. They began a hasty retreat up through Albania and southern Yugoslavia. They were harried all the way by Albanian and Yugoslav partisans. By mid-October 1944, the Red Army had reached the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade. Only now did it begin to swing north and west towards Hungary and then Germany. German reinforcements poured into Hungary to support the pro-Nazi puppet government, but the Red Army ground on. Eight weeks later, it laid siege to Budapest. The siege lasted over 6 weeks before the German puppet government collapsed. By the end of 1944, most of Eastern Europe lay in Stalin's grasp. His troops controlled the Baltic states and Poland, Romania and Bulgaria. Pro-Soviet forces ruled in Yugoslavia and Albania. Hungary and Czechoslovakia were in his sights. Stalin had successfully laid the foundations for the future Soviet bloc. He could now, at last, move on to Germany. But in the west, Allied forces were also approaching the German border. The race was on to be the first to take Berlin.